The evening air had a bite to it as Tom huddled deeper into his worn jacket. Fall in the city was beautiful, with golden leaves drifting down to the sidewalks, but for someone without a warm place to sleep. The dropping temperatures meant harder days ahead. Tom walked slowly past the line of shops and cafes that made up the heart of downtown. His stomach growled, a painful reminder that he hadn't eaten since yesterday morning when a kind woman had bought him a sandwich. He tried not to look at the people sitting inside the warmly lit buildings, enjoying hot meals and easy conversation, but his eyes betrayed him as he passed the Golden Note Cafe. Through the large front window, he could see tables filled with happy customers. The smell of fresh coffee and baked bread drifted out each time the door opened. But what caught Tom's eye wasn't the food. It was the piano. A beautiful grand piano sitting in the corner of the cafe, its polished surface gleaming under soft lights. Tom stopped walking and stared at it. His fingers tingled with memory. How long had it been since he'd touched a piano? 3 years, 4? Time blurred when you lived on the streets. Before he could talk himself out of it, Tom pushed open the door of the cafe. Warm air rushed to meet him, along with the clinking of cups and the hum of conversation. A few heads turned his way, and he saw the familiar expressions. The quick glance followed by deliberate looking away, the subtle shifting of bags closer, the slight frowns. He was used to it. The owner, a stocky man with graying hair and a neat apron, looked up from behind the counter. His expression hardened slightly as he took in Tom's appearance. The unshaven face, the dirty jeans, the backpack that held everything Tom owned in the world. "Can I help you?" the owner asked, his tone making it clear that he hoped the answer was no. Tom cleared his throat. It had been a while since he'd spoken to anyone. "That piano," he said, nodding toward the corner. "Does anyone play it?" The owner looked surprised at the question. "We have a college student who comes in on weekends." "Why?" Tom's heart was pounding. He hadn't planned this, but hunger and the sight of the piano had given him an idea. "I was wondering, could I play? For food?" The owner stared at him, then let out a short laugh. "You want to play the piano? For food?" Tom nodded, trying to stand straighter despite his exhaustion. "I used to play before." He gestured vaguely at himself at what his life had become. The owner, whose name tag read Pete, looked skeptical. His eyes moved from Tom to the expensive piano and back again. A few nearby customers were watching now, curious about the exchange. "Look, buddy," Pete said, lowering his voice. "That's a Yamaha Grand. It cost more than my first car. I can't just let anyone—" "Please," Tom interrupted, his voice quiet but steady. "Just one song. If I'm terrible, I'll leave right away. But if I'm good—" He left the sentence hanging, hope making his tired eyes brighter. Pete looked at him for a long moment. Something in Tom's face, a shadow of who he had been perhaps, made Pete hesitate. Finally he shrugged. "Fine," he said with a slight smirk. "If you can actually play, I'll feed you. But just one song. And if you're wasting my time, you're out of here. Deal?" Tom nodded, relief washing over him. "Deal." As Pete guided him to the piano, Tom was aware of the eyes following them. A middle-aged couple whispered to each other. A young woman with headphones removed them, curious. The barista behind the counter paused in making a drink. "It's all yours," Pete said, gesturing to the piano with a hint of challenge in his voice. "Impress me?" Tom set his backpack down gently beside the bench. He hadn't sat at a piano in so long that the simple act of pulling out the bench felt sacred. The polished keys gleamed up at him, ivory and ebony waiting patiently for his touch. He placed his hands on the keys and was suddenly struck by how dirty they looked against the pristine white. His nails were uneven, his skin rough and cracked from exposure to the elements. For a moment, doubt crashed over him. What was he thinking? He didn't belong here, at this beautiful instrument in this warm cafe filled with normal people living normal lives. Tom closed his eyes, fighting back the urge to stand up and walk right back out into the cold. His hands trembled slightly. Behind him, he heard someone whisper, "Is he actually going to play?" The doubt and hunger and exhaustion swirled together in his mind. But underneath it all was something else. The memory of music, of how it had once been the center of his world. Before the accident, before the medical bills, before he'd lost everything. He took a deep breath and began to play. The first notes were tentative, his fingers remembering their way. He started with something simple, a melody he'd composed years ago when life was different. But as the familiar sensation of keys beneath his fingers awakened something within him, his confidence grew. The cafe had gone quiet. Tom didn't notice. He was lost in the music now, his body remembering what his mind had tried to forget. His fingers moved faster, more surely. As he transitioned into Debussy's Clair de Lune, the delicate notes floated through the cafe like a spell being cast. A woman sitting near the window put down her phone and turned to watch. The barista stopped in the middle of wiping down the counter, cloth suspended in air. Pete stood with his arms crossed, his earlier skepticism melting into astonishment. Tom swayed slightly on the bench as the music built. The pain in his empty stomach faded away. The embarrassment of his appearance no longer mattered. For these few minutes, he wasn't a homeless man begging for food. He was just a musician, speaking the universal language that needed no translation. As he played the final gentle notes of the piece, letting them fade into the hushed cafe, Tom kept his eyes closed for an extra moment. He was afraid to open them, afraid to return to reality where he was still hungry, still homeless, still alone. The silence that followed was broken by a single clap, then another, and suddenly the whole cafe erupted in applause. Tom opened his eyes, startled by the reaction. Every face was turned toward him, wearing expressions of amazement and respect. Pete stood closest to the piano, his arms no longer crossed but hanging loosely at his sides. The smugness was gone from his face, replaced by something that looked like regret, mixed with admiration. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Pete asked, his voice genuinely curious now. Tom's throat felt tight. "Music school," he said simply. "I had a scholarship. Long time ago now." An older woman at a nearby table wiped a tear from her eye. "That was beautiful," she said. "Simply beautiful." "I've never heard that played so well," added a man in a business suit. "And I've been to the symphony." Pete shook his head slowly as if trying to reconcile the man sitting at his piano with the assumptions he'd made minutes earlier. He walked over to Tom and put a hand on his shoulder. "I think you've more than earned a meal," Pete said, a new respect in his voice. "What would you like?" Tom looked up, hardly able to believe it had worked. "Anything hot," he said, the reality of his hunger returning now that the music had stopped. "And maybe some coffee?" "You got it," Pete said. "And while you eat, maybe you could tell me your story? How someone who plays like that ends up—" He trailed off, gesturing vaguely at Tom's appearance. "It's not a happy story," Tom warned. "Standing up from the bench. Most true ones aren't," Pete replied. "But I'd still like to hear it." He guided Tom to a small table near the piano. "And after you eat, would you consider playing again? My customers seem to appreciate your talent more than our weekend performer." For the first time in months, maybe years, Tom felt a small spark of hope ignite within him. One meal wouldn't change his situation. One night of playing wouldn't give him back all he had lost. But as he sat down at the table and felt the warmth of the cafe embrace him, as he saw people looking at him with respect rather than pity or disgust, he allowed himself to believe that perhaps this could be a beginning. Outside, the autumn wind continued to blow, scattering leaves across the sidewalk. But inside the Golden Note Cafe, something unexpected had taken root, a chance encounter that would soon change more lives than just Tom's. Tom wrapped his hands around the warm mug of coffee, savoring the heat that spread through his cold fingers. The simple pleasure of sitting at a clean table in a warm room felt almost overwhelming after so many months of discomfort. Pete returned from the kitchen carrying a large plate piled with roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and steamed vegetables. The smell made Tom's mouth water instantly. "Our daily special," Pete said, placing the plate in front of Tom. "And some fresh bread." He added a basket of rolls still warm from the oven. Tom stared at the food, momentarily speechless. "This is—" "Thank you." His voice caught slightly. It had been so long since someone had treated him with such simple kindness. "You earned it," Pete said, sitting down across from Tom. "That was some playing." Tom picked up his fork with slightly trembling hands and took a bite of the chicken. The flavor exploded in his mouth, and he had to force himself to eat slowly with dignity, though his body screamed at him to devour everything as quickly as possible. The cafe had returned to its normal hum of activity, but Tom noticed people glancing his way with curious eyes rather than dismissive ones. His performance had changed something, at least temporarily. So, Pete said after Tom had eaten a few bites. Music school, you said? Tom nodded, taking a sip of coffee before answering. Johnson Institute of Music in Chicago. I had a full scholarship. That's impressive, Pete said. What happened? If you don't mind me asking. Tom's eyes drifted to the window where the streetlights were beginning to glow against the darkening sky. The story wasn't one he told often, but something about Pete's genuine interest made him willing to share. My mom got sick during my final year, Tom said quietly. Cancer. I was an only child and my dad had been gone for years. There was no one else to take care of her. Pete nodded, understanding beginning to dawn on his face. I left school to be with her. Thought I'd go back after. Tom paused, the old grief still sharp despite the years. But the medical bills piled up. I sold my piano first. Then my car. Eventually the house too. By the time she passed, I had nothing left except debt. I'm sorry, Pete said simply. Tom shrugged, taking another bite of food. I got work here and there. Played at bars, gave some lessons, but nothing steady. Then I injured my hand in a construction job. He flexed his left hand, showing a slight stiffness in 2 fingers. Couldn't play properly for almost a year. By then, I'd lost my apartment. And once you're on the streets, it's hard to get back up, Pete finished for him. Very hard, Tom agreed. You need an address to get a job. You need a job to get an address. You need clean clothes for interviews, a phone number, a shower. He gestured at himself with a sad smile. Not many music schools looking to hire someone who sleeps in shelters. A young woman who had been listening from a nearby table suddenly approached. She had kind eyes and carried a tablet in her hands. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said, but I recorded your performance on my phone. I hope that's okay? It was so beautiful and I just... She hesitated, then turned her tablet around to show them. On the screen was a social media post. A video of Tom playing the piano with text above it. Homeless man plays Debussy at local cafe and leaves everyone in tears. Music knows no boundaries. Hidden talent, her second chances. Tom stared at the screen, an odd feeling washing over him. It already has 300 likes, the woman said excitedly. And people are sharing it. I think it might go viral. Pete looked from the tablet to Tom. Do you mind that she posted it? Tom wasn't sure how to feel. On one hand, the idea of being some kind of internet curiosity made him uncomfortable. On the other hand, he felt a faint stirring of something that might have been pride, that people were connecting with his music again. I guess it's okay, he said finally. It's just playing piano. The woman smiled brightly. My name's Lisa, by the way. I'm a music teacher at the community college. And that was definitely not just playing piano. That was art. Tom felt a blush creep up his neck. Thank you. Another customer approached their table, an older gentleman in a tweed jacket. Young man, I wonder if you take requests. I'd love to hear some Chopin. Before Tom could answer, another voice chimed in. Oh yes, can you play for Elise? It's my favorite. Pete raised an eyebrow at Tom. Seems you've got some fans. Feel up to playing a bit more? Tom looked at his half-finished plate of food. Maybe after I eat? Pete nodded and stood up. Folks, our guest musician will do a few more pieces after he finishes his dinner. In the meantime, drinks are on the house for the next 15 minutes. A small cheer went up from the customers. The cafe, which had been preparing to slow down for the evening, suddenly felt energized with anticipation. Tom watched in amazement as Pete moved back behind the counter to handle the rush of drink orders. This wasn't how he had expected his evening to go when he'd stopped outside the window an hour ago, driven by hunger and a desperate idea. Lisa sat down in the chair Pete had vacated. Would you mind if I asked you some questions? About your background in music? Tom hesitated, then nodded. As he finished his meal, Lisa asked about his training, his favorite composers, his technique. It felt strange to talk about music so seriously again, to be treated like a musician rather than just a homeless man. Strange, but good. By the time he'd cleared his plate, a crowd had gathered near the piano. Pete had turned down the cafe's background music, and there was a sense of expectancy in the air. Ready? Pete asked, coming to clear Tom's empty plate. Tom nodded, suddenly feeling nervous. Playing when no one expected anything had been one thing. Playing now, with an audience actually waiting to hear him, was different. He made his way back to the piano, conscious of his shabby clothes and unwashed hair. But as he sat down at the bench again, He realized that no one seemed to care about his appearance anymore. They were looking at his hands, waiting for the music. "Any requests?" he asked, his voice stronger now after food and coffee. Several people called out suggestions. Tom smiled slightly. "How about we start with Chopin for the gentleman in the tweed jacket?" The man beamed with pleasure as Tom began to play Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. The piece started softly, almost tentatively, like a question being asked. Then it opened up, growing more confident, as if the music itself was experiencing the same reawakening that Tom felt inside. People had pulled chairs closer to the piano. Others stood, drinks in hand, swaying slightly to the music. A few had phones out, recording. Tom closed his eyes, letting himself get lost in the piece. When the final notes faded, there was a moment of perfect silence before the applause broke out. Tom opened his eyes to see faces filled with emotion. Some people were even wiping away tears. Without pausing, he transitioned into Fur-Elise, smiling as he heard someone gasp with delight. He played with a lightness he hadn't felt in years, adding his own subtle interpretations to the familiar piece. For the next hour, Tom played piece after piece, some classical, some modern, even a few of his own compositions. He felt like he was waking up from a long sleep, remembering who he had been before loss and hardship had reshaped his life. Pete kept the cafe open well past its usual closing time. Customers came and went, but a core group stayed, enchanted by the unexpected concert. Someone had put a tip jar on top of the piano, and to Tom's amazement, people were filling it with bills. Finally, his fingers tired and his heart full, Tom played a gentle, thoughtful rendition of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata as his closing piece. As the last chord hung in the air, he looked up to see that the cafe had fallen completely silent again. Pete approached the piano, clapping along with the others. "Tom," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I think we can do better than one meal." He picked up the tip jar and handed it to Tom. "This is yours, obviously, but I'd also like to offer you something else." Tom looked at him questioningly. "A job," Pete said simply. "Playing here regular evenings?" "Paid, of course, and—" He hesitated, then continued. "I've got a small room above the cafe. Nothing fancy, just storage now, but it could be fixed up. It would give you a place to stay and a dress." Tom stared at him, unable to speak. Around them, customers murmured approval, some even applauding the idea. "You don't have to decide right now," Pete added, seeing Tom's overwhelmed expression. "But the offer's there." Lisa stepped forward. "And I'd like to offer you practice time at the college. We have several pianos that sit empty most afternoons." Tom looked from Pete to Lisa, then at the other faces watching him with genuine interest and goodwill. He thought of all the nights he'd spent in shelters or huddled in doorways, feeling invisible to the world passing by. He thought of how close he'd come to giving up on music entirely. "I don't know what to say," he finally managed, his voice thick with emotion. An elderly woman in the front row smiled gently. "Say yes, young man, and then play us one more song." Tom looked down at his hands, the hands that had labored on construction sites, that had grown rough from life on the streets, but that still somehow remembered how to create beauty. He felt a smile spread across his face, unfamiliar but welcome, like an old friend returning after a long absence. "Yes," he said simply, "and thank you." As he turned back to the keys to play one final piece, Tom felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the sensation that tomorrow might be better than today. That this unexpected evening might be not just a brief respite from hardship, but the first note of a new composition altogether. The morning sun streamed through the small window, casting a warm rectangle of light across Tom's face. He blinked awake, momentarily confused by the softness beneath him. It took a few seconds to remember where he was. In the small room above the Golden Note Cafe, on a real bed instead of a shelter cot or park bench. 2 weeks had passed since that life-changing evening when he'd first walked into the cafe. 2 weeks that felt like stepping into someone else's life. Tom sat up and looked around the modest space. It wasn't much, just a twin bed, a dresser with a lamp, and a small bathroom with a shower. But to him it was a palace. Pete had helped him clean it up, paint the walls a soft blue, and bring in the basic furniture. Customers had contributed too. The bedding came from Lisa, the music teacher. A small bookshelf appeared, courtesy of the older gentleman in the tweed jacket. who turned out to be a retired literature professor named Henry. On top of the dresser sat the thing Tom valued most, a small digital keyboard that Lisa had loaned him indefinitely. It wasn't a grand piano, but it had weighted keys and a headphone jack, allowing him to practice at any hour without disturbing anyone below. Tom swung his legs over the side of the bed and ran his hands over his face. His reflection in the small mirror above the dresser still surprised him, clean-shaven, hair neatly trimmed. The haunted look in his eyes was fading, replaced by something steadier. He checked the clock, 9:30 a.m. The cafe had been open since 7, but Pete had insisted Tom take mornings for himself. "You're playing evenings, you need your rest," Pete had said firmly, brushing away Tom's protests that he should help with the morning rush too. After a quick shower, Tom dressed in the clean clothes that now filled his dresser. Nothing fancy, just basics from a local thrift store, but worlds away from the layers of worn, dirty garments he'd lived in before. The simple dignity of clean socks and a shirt without holes still felt like a luxury. Downstairs, the cafe hummed with mid-morning activity. A few regulars looked up and waved as Tom emerged from the back stairway. That was another strange new reality. Being recognized, greeted, treated like he belonged. "There he is," Pete called from behind the counter. "Our resident maestro." Tom smiled, still not entirely comfortable with the attention but learning to accept it. "Morning. Need any help? You could take these to table 6, Pete said, sliding 2 plates of eggs and toast across the counter. "And then sit down and eat something yourself. You're still too skinny." Tom delivered the food to an elderly couple who thanked him by name, then returned to the counter where Pete was already fixing him breakfast. "Sleep okay?" Pete asked, cracking eggs into a pan. Tom nodded. "Better than okay. Good, you've got a busy day ahead." Pete flipped the eggs. "Lisa called. Said she can meet you at the college at 1 o'clock, and then you're playing here from 6 to 9. Tom felt a small flutter of nervousness. His weeknight performances at the cafe had quickly become popular, with customers specifically coming to hear him play. But tonight would be Friday, the busiest night of the week. "Oh, and this came for you," Pete added, reaching under the counter. He handed Tom a small stack of mail, actual mail addressed to Tom at the cafe's address. Tom stared at the envelopes in wonder. It was such a normal thing, receiving mail, but it represented something profound, proof of his existence in the official world again. He had an address. He existed on paper. He was somewhere, not just anywhere. One envelope caught his eye, the Johnson Institute of Music logo in the corner. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. "What is it?" Pete asked, sliding a plate of eggs and toast in front of Tom. "I wrote to my old school," Tom said quietly, unfolding the letter, "just to see if there was any chance of finishing my degree someday." Pete leaned against the counter as Tom read the letter, his expression growing more confused with each line. "I don't understand," Tom finally said. "They're saying my scholarship is still valid? That can't be right. It's been years." Pete took the letter and read it carefully. "Says here someone established a special fund for students who had to leave due to family hardship. And you qualify." He looked up. "Did you tell them about your mother when you wrote to them?" Tom nodded, still processing. "Well, seems like someone there remembers you, or really believes in second chances." Pete handed the letter back. "Says you can resume studies next semester if you want, either on campus or through their distance program." Tom read the letter again, afraid he was misunderstanding. "This can't be real. Seems plenty real to me," Pete said. "Official letterhead and everything." The bell above the cafe door jingled and Lisa walked in, her face lighting up when she saw Tom. Perfect timing. "I was just coming to remind you about our practice session." She noticed the letter in Tom's hands. "What's that?" Tom wordlessly handed it to her. As a music teacher herself, she'd understand better than anyone what this meant. Lisa read quickly, her eyes widening. "Tom, this is amazing." She looked up. "Are you going to accept?" Tom's mind raced with possibilities and obstacles. "I don't know if I can. I have responsibilities here now, and money for living expenses. The room upstairs is yours as long as you need it," Pete cut in firmly. "And the job too. And the college has practice rooms you can use anytime," Lisa added. "Plus, look, they're offering online courses." "You could do both. Work here and study." Tom felt overwhelmed by their immediate support, by the sudden expansion of a future that had seemed so limited just weeks ago. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll think about it," Pete suggested, patting Tom's shoulder. "But eat your breakfast first. Food gets cold, opportunities don't." Tom managed a smile and picked up his fork, though his appetite had been replaced by a swirl of emotions. As he ate, Lisa chatted excitedly about the possibilities the letter represented, while Pete kept the cafe running smoothly around them. A customer approached, Diane, a middle-aged woman who had been at the cafe the first night Tom played and had returned several times since. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, "but I wanted to show Tom something before I left." She held out her phone, open to a video playing on a social media site. Tom recognized himself at the piano, playing one of his own compositions from a few nights ago. The video had a counter beneath it showing over 200,000 views. "You're famous," Diane said with a smile. "The comments are amazing. People from all over asking where they can hear more of your music." Tom stared at the tiny version of himself on the screen, playing with closed eyes, completely lost in the music. It was strange to see himself that way, not as the homeless man he'd been, but as a musician, pure and simple. "There's more," Lisa said, pulling out her own phone. "Remember that first video of you playing Debussy? A classical music blog picked it up. They're calling you the cafe pianist. People are asking if you have recordings available." "Recordings?" Tom repeated, feeling like he was in a dream. "I don't have any recordings." "But you could," Lisa said, her eyes bright with excitement. "The college has a recording studio. It's basic, but it works. We use it for student projects. I could reserve time for you. And we could sell CDs here at the cafe," Pete added, warming to the idea. "People ask about it all the time." Tom put down his fork, feeling slightly dizzy from the speed at which his life was transforming. 3 weeks ago, he'd been invisible, just another homeless man people avoided looking at. Now strangers on the internet were asking to hear his music. His old school was offering him a chance to finish his degree. He had a room, a job, friends who believed in him. "Take a breath," Pete advised, noticing Tom's overwhelmed expression. "One thing at a time." Tom nodded gratefully. "I need to think about all this. It's a lot." "Of course it is," Lisa agreed. "But it's all good, isn't it?" "Yes," Tom said slowly. "It's good. It's just fast. Life can change in an instant," Diane said gently. "Sometimes for the worse, but sometimes for the better too." Tom knew that truth all too well. The reverse had happened to him. One day he'd been a promising music student. The next he'd been rushing home to his mother's bedside, beginning a downward slide that had ended with him on the streets. He'd never imagined the journey could work in reverse, that he could climb back up from where he'd fallen. "I should get ready for my practice session with Lisa," Tom said, gathering himself. The routine of daily work and practice had become an anchor in the swirling sea of changes. Pete nodded. "And I need you sharp for tonight. Full house expected." "Thanks to your new fan club," Lisa teased. "The cafe pianist's growing audience." Tom shook his head, still not used to this kind of talk. "They just like the music." "They like the musician too," Diane corrected kindly. "And his story. Everyone loves a comeback." Tom finished his breakfast and helped clear dishes before heading upstairs to get his sheet music. As he gathered his things, his eyes fell on the letter from the music school. Still hard to believe. The Tom from a month ago wouldn't have dared to hope for any of this. That Tom had been focused solely on survival, finding the next meal, the next safe place to sleep. The idea of returning to music school would have seemed as impossible as flying to the moon. But now, Tom picked up the letter again, reading the words that offered him a bridge back to his old dreams. It wasn't just about music school. It was about the parts of himself he'd thought were lost forever. His identity as a musician, his future, his hope. Outside the window, he could see people walking into the cafe, some specifically coming to hear him play later. In the corner of the room, the small keyboard waited for his practice session with Lisa. In his hand, the letter promised education and credentials that could open doors beyond the cafe. All because he'd gathered his courage 3 weeks ago and asked a simple question: "Can I play for food?" The universe, it seemed, had answered with so much more than a meal. The recording studio at the community college was nothing fancy, just a small room with sound-dampening panels, a decent microphone, and basic equipment. But to Tom, sitting at the upright piano with headphones on, it felt like hallowed ground. That was perfect. Lisa's voice came through his headphones. Let's do one more take of the Chopin and then we can move on to your original piece. Tom nodded, flexing his fingers before placing them back on the keys. It was his third recording session, part of a project that had started as Lisa's idea but had quickly taken on a life of its own. The Café Pianist, First Sessions, a simple album of classical favorites and a few of Tom's own compositions. As he played the familiar notes of Chopin's Nocturne, Tom marveled at how quickly life could change course. 2 months had passed since that desperate evening when he'd first walked into the Golden Note Cafe. Now he was recording an album, taking online classes to finish his degree, and performing regularly to crowds that grew larger each week. When he finished the piece, Lisa gave him a thumbs up from behind the glass. Beautiful. I think we've got it. She adjusted some settings on the computer. Ready for your original composition? Tom took a deep breath. Playing the classics was one thing. Those pieces had stood the test of time. But sharing his own music felt more vulnerable, like offering a piece of his soul for judgment. It's still rough, he warned. Lisa smiled encouragingly. That's what these sessions are for. Take your time. Tom closed his eyes, letting his mind drift back to the days after his mother's diagnosis, when he'd started composing this particular piece. It had begun as an expression of fear and grief, but as he'd continued working on it over the years, even during his darkest times on the streets, it had evolved into something more complex. There was still sorrow in the melody, but also resilience, and toward the end, something like peace. His fingers found the keys, and he began to play. The piece started softly, hesitantly, like someone feeling their way through darkness. Then it built, growing more confident with occasional discordant notes that somehow made the harmonious parts more powerful. By the time he reached the final movement, the music had transformed into something hopeful without denying the pain that came before. When the last note faded, Tom opened his eyes to see Lisa wiping away a tear. Tom, she said, her voice slightly choked. I don't even have words. He ducked his head, embarrassed but pleased. It's called The Long Way Home. It's extraordinary, Lisa said. Honestly, that needs to be the centerpiece of the album. Tom felt a flush of pride. He'd composed the piece during the lowest points of his life, working out sections in his head while sleeping in shelters, sometimes quietly tapping rhythms on park benches when no piano was available. Music had been his lifeline when everything else was gone, and now it was bringing him back. After the session, they walked across the college campus together. It was a mild spring day with students lounging on the grass, studying or chatting in the sunshine. I've been meaning to ask you something, Lisa said as they passed the main music building. The department is looking for a part-time piano instructor for beginners next semester. Would you be interested? Tom stopped walking. Me, teaching here? Lisa nodded. You'd be perfect. You're patient, you explain concepts well. I've seen you with the kids who come into the cafe, and your playing is beautiful. But I haven't even finished my degree, Tom protested. You will have by fall, Lisa pointed out. And honestly, your life experience gives you something many technically perfect players don't have. Real emotional depth. That matters in teaching. Tom looked around at the campus, at the students going about their day, and tried to picture himself as one of the instructors. It seemed impossible, and yet, so many impossible things had already happened. I'll think about it, he promised. Lisa smiled. That's all I ask. When they reached the parking lot, Lisa offered him a ride back to the cafe, but Tom declined. I think I'll walk. It's nice out and I could use the time to think. The walk from the college to downtown took about 40 minutes. 2 months ago, Tom would have been hyper-aware of how people looked at him as he walked. The careful aversion of eyes that told him he was unwelcome, the subtle movements to create more distance on the sidewalk. Now, in clean clothes with a backpack full of sheet music instead of all his worldly possessions, he was just another person going about his day. Halfway to the cafe, he passed a park where he had often slept when the shelters were full. He paused, looking at the bench that had been his bed more times than he could count. A man sat there now, ragged and tired-looking, a small cart of belongings beside him. Tom felt a complicated mix of emotions: gratitude for his changed circumstances, guilt that he'd found a way out when so many hadn't, and a nagging fear that it could all disappear as quickly as it had come. Making a decision, he walked to a nearby food truck, bought 2 sandwiches and bottles of water, and returned to the park. The man looked up warily as Tom approached. "Hungry?" Tom asked simply, holding out the food. The man hesitated, then reached for the sandwich. "Thanks." Tom sat down on the other end of the bench. "I'm Tom." "Ray," the man replied, unwrapping the sandwich with careful movements. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Ray spoke again. "You from around here?" "Now I am," Tom said. "I work at the Golden Note Cafe downtown. Play piano there." Ray nodded. "Think I've heard about that. Guy who was homeless and plays real good?" Tom smiled slightly. "That's me." Ray studied him with new interest. "For real? I thought that was just one of those stories people make up." "It's real," Tom confirmed. "I got lucky. Right place, right time, right people." "And talent," Ray added, taking another bite of his sandwich. "Heard you got talent." Tom shrugged modestly. "I've been playing since I was a kid." "Must be nice," Ray said, looking down at his weathered hands. "Having something like that. What about you?" Tom asked. "What did you do on before?" Ray understood the unspoken part of the question. "I was a carpenter." "Good one, too. Had my own business." He flexed his right hand, which Tom now noticed was somewhat stiff. "Got hurt. Lost clients. Then lost my shop. You know how it goes." Tom did know. One piece of bad luck leading to another and another, until you found yourself on a bench in the park, invisible to most of the world. An idea began to form in Tom's mind. "The cafe where I work, the owner's been talking about renovating the upstairs, making another room like mine for someone else who needs a fresh start." Ray looked at him sharply. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because he needs someone who knows carpentry," Tom said. "And I just found someone who does." Ray's expression was guarded, hopeful and suspicious all at once. "You don't know me." "I know enough," Tom replied. "I know what it's like to sit on this bench, and I know what it's like when someone takes a chance on you." Ray was quiet for a long moment. "Your boss just gonna hire some random homeless guy on your say-so?" "Pete's not exactly conventional," Tom said with a small smile. "He hired me after I played one song, remember? And he's been talking about this project for weeks." Tom pulled out his phone, another recent addition to his life, and texted Pete. "Found a carpenter for the upstairs renovation. Bringing him by to meet you later if that's okay." The reply came quickly. "Perfect timing. Was just getting quotes. Bring him over." Tom showed Ray the message. "See, at least come meet him. Worst case, you get another meal. Best case." He gestured to himself, evidence of what the best case might look like. Ray looked skeptical but nodded slowly. Got nothing to lose, I guess. They finished their food, then walked together toward the cafe. Tom was aware of the strange symmetry, him leading someone else to the same door he'd nervously approached months ago. He wondered if this was how it would be from now on, his life somehow linked to both worlds, the one he'd escaped and the one he was building. The cafe was between the lunch and dinner rushes, relatively quiet except for a few customers lingering over coffee. Pete looked up from the counter as they entered, his eyes taking in Ray's appearance with the same initial wariness he'd once shown Tom. But then he looked at Tom and his expression softened. "This must be your carpenter," Pete said, coming around the counter with his hand extended. "I'm Pete." Ray hesitated, then shook Pete's hand. "Ray." "Tom says you know your way around construction," Pete said, getting straight to the point. Ray nodded. 20 years experience. Had my own business for 12 of those. "Good. Because I've got more customers than seats these days thanks to our piano man here, and I need to expand." Pete gestured toward the ceiling. "Got space upstairs that needs work. Thinking of making another room like Tom's, plus maybe a small seating area for private events. Can you handle that?" "I'd need to see the space," Ray said cautiously. "And I don't have tools anymore." "Tools I've got," Pete said. Previous tenant left a bunch in the basement. As for seeing the space, no time like the present. As Pete led Ray upstairs to show him the renovation site, Tom settled at the piano. He didn't have to play for another few hours, but the instrument called to him. He began a gentle improvisation, letting his fingers wander across the keys while his mind processed the day's events. From the recording studio to the job offer at the college to his encounter with Ray, it felt like his life was expanding in ways he couldn't have imagined. There were still challenges. He worried about keeping up with his studies. about whether his music would find an audience beyond the cafe, about how to balance all these new opportunities. But for the first time in years, his worries were about growth rather than survival, and that made all the difference. Tom looked up to see Pete and Ray coming back downstairs, deep in conversation about lumber and drywall and electrical work. Ray's face had changed subtly. There was purpose there now and the faintest glimmer of hope. Tom smiled and continued playing, the music flowing easily now. One note leading to another, just like one small kindness could lead to the next. A melody of second chances, played on keys that had once seemed forever beyond his reach. The community center buzzed with activity as volunteers arranged chairs in neat rows facing the small stage. Tom stood off to the side, watching as Pete and Ray hung a banner across the back wall. First annual Second Chance benefit concert. 1 year had passed since that life-changing night when a hungry man had walked into a cafe and asked to play the piano for food. In that year, Tom's world had transformed beyond recognition. His album, The Cafe Pianist, had sold over 1,000 copies, mostly from the counter at the Golden Note Cafe, but increasingly online as well. He had completed his music degree and was now teaching piano 3 days a week at the community college. And most meaningful of all, he had become part of a community that was working to help others find their way back from the edge. Nervous? Lisa asked, joining him by the wall. Tom smiled. A little. It's bigger than I expected. 300 tickets sold, Lisa confirmed. Plus the online stream. She squeezed his arm encouragingly. People believe in what we're doing. What they were doing was raising money for the Golden Note Foundation, a small nonprofit started by Pete, Tom, and a few dedicated cafe regulars. Its mission was simple, to provide transitional housing and job training for people experiencing homelessness. The foundation had already renovated 3 rooms above local businesses, creating safe spaces where people could begin rebuilding their lives. Ray had been the first beneficiary after Tom, moving into the second room above the cafe 6 months ago. Now he worked full-time as Pete's maintenance manager, overseeing all the renovation projects. He was currently across the room, carefully adjusting the grand piano that had been loaned for the evening's performance. Tom checked his watch. Almost time. I'll let people know we're starting soon, Lisa said, heading toward the entrance where attendees were still arriving. Tom made his way backstage, passing Henry, the retired literature professor, who was reviewing his notes as the evening's MC. In the small preparation room, Tom found Pete arranging refreshments for the performers. Full house, Pete said with satisfaction. And the mayor actually showed up. Tom raised his eyebrows. Really? Front row, Pete confirmed. Brought some city council members too. Seems like they want to talk about expanding the program. Tom shook his head in wonder. I still can't believe how this has all snowballed. Pete clasped his shoulder. That's what happens when you hit the right note. Things resonate. A volunteer poked her head in the door. 5 minutes, everyone. Tom straightened his tie, another change from a year ago when he hadn't owned anything more formal than a clean t-shirt. Now he wore a simple dark suit, borrowed from Pete but tailored to fit him. He looked like what he was becoming, a respected musician and teacher, someone with a place in the world. The concert began with Henry's warm introduction, explaining the foundation's work and introducing Pete, who spoke briefly about how it all started. Then it was Tom's turn. As he walked onto the stage, facing the largest audience he'd ever played for, Tom felt a moment of vertigo. All these people had come to hear him, the homeless man from the cafe whose story had touched something in them. He sat at the piano, took a deep breath, and began to play. He started with Debussy's Clair de Lune, the piece he'd played that very first night. As the familiar notes flowed from his fingers, Tom found himself thinking of how far he'd come, yet how that core part of him, the musician who lived for those moments of pure expression, had always been there, even during his darkest days. The first half of the concert featured classical pieces, interspersed with Tom's own compositions. The audience listened with rapt attention, breaking into enthusiastic applause after each piece. Tom could see faces in the front rows, Pete beaming with pride, Lisa nodding appreciatively at particularly beautiful passages, Ray watching with quiet respect, and beyond them, rows of strangers who had been moved by his story and his music. People who had paid to be here, whose contributions would help others find their way back just as Tom had. During the intermission, Tom slipped backstage for a glass of water. He was joined by Diane, the cafe regular who had first shared his video online. "You're playing beautifully," she said. "But then you always do," Tom smiled. "Thank you. And thanks for everything you did to help get the word out. I wouldn't be here without that." Diane shook her head. "You'd be exactly where you are. Maybe it would have taken a bit longer. But talent and determination like yours always find a way." The second half of the concert began with a surprise. 3 of Tom's piano students performing a piece they had prepared especially for the event. Tom watched from the wings, feeling a swell of pride as the young players made their way through the simple arrangement. Teaching had become one of his unexpected joys, passing on his love of music to others. When it was his turn again, Tom returned to the stage, but this time he wasn't alone. He was joined by Ray, who carried a guitar. "For those who don't know," Tom said, speaking into the microphone for the first time that evening, "Ray is our foundation's second success story. He moved from a park bench to a room above the cafe, and now has his own apartment downtown." The audience applauded as Ray gave a shy wave. "What most people don't know," Tom continued, "is that before Ray was a carpenter, he played guitar in a blues band. When I found this out, I knew we had to play something together tonight." They launched into a blues-infused version of The Long Way Home, Tom's signature composition. Ray's guitar added new dimensions to the piece, the 2 instruments speaking to each other in a musical conversation about loss, perseverance, and finding your way back. As they played the final notes, the audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation. Tom and Ray stood together, accepting the applause with grateful nods. But the evening wasn't over. For the finale, Tom had planned something special. He returned to the microphone. "A year ago, I walked into a cafe and asked if I could play for food," he said simply. "I was hungry, homeless, and had lost hope. But that night changed everything for me." He gestured to Pete in the front row. "One person took a chance on me, then another, and now here we all are, trying to create those same opportunities for others." Tom paused, gathering his thoughts. "Before our final piece tonight, I want to introduce you to someone who reminded me recently of where I started and how far I still have to go." He motioned to the side of the stage, and a young woman walked out hesitantly. She looked to be in her early 20s with a tentative smile and nervous eyes. "This is Amy," Tom said. "Until 2 weeks ago, Amy was living in her car after losing her apartment. She's a student at the community college, studying while working 2 jobs, and she's our foundation's newest resident, living in the room we just finished renovating above the bookstore downtown." The audience applauded encouragingly as Amy gave a small wave. "What Amy doesn't know," Tom continued, "is that tonight's ticket sales have raised enough to fund a full scholarship for her final year of school. She won't have to choose between education and housing anymore." Amy's hands flew to her mouth as tears filled her eyes. The audience erupted in applause again, even louder this time. Tom turned to her with a smile. "But that's not why I asked you to join me on stage." When Amy moved into her room, she found the keyboard I'd left behind when I moved to my own apartment. "And it turns out she plays too." He gestured to the piano. "Would you join me?" Amy looked stunned but nodded. Together they sat at the piano, Tom on the left for the lower notes, Amy on the right for the higher ones. They began to play a duet arrangement of Beethoven's Ode to Joy that Tom had prepared, knowing it was one of the pieces Amy had mentioned she loved. As their hands moved across the keys, creating music together, Tom felt a powerful sense of completion. The circle that had begun a year ago was continuing. Music which had saved him was now helping to save others. The notes they played spoke of joy, yes, but also of connection, of one person reaching out to another in understanding and hope. When the final triumphant chord faded, the audience was on its feet again. Tom and Amy stood, accepting the applause. Pete joined them on stage, along with Ray, Lisa, and the other foundation volunteers. They linked hands and took a bow together. Later, as people mingled at the reception, Tom found a quiet moment to step outside for some fresh air. The night was clear and cool, stars visible despite the city lights. He thought about how not so long ago he had slept under these same stars, wondering if he'd ever find his way back to the life he'd lost. The door opened behind him, and Pete stepped out holding 2 cups of coffee. "Quite a night," Pete said, handing Tom one of the cups. Tom nodded. I keep thinking about that first night at the cafe, how close I came to walking past instead of coming in. But you didn't, Pete said. You took a chance. We both did, Tom replied. They stood in companionable silence, sipping their coffee and looking up at the stars. You know what I'm proudest of? Pete finally said. It's not just that you got back on your feet. It's that you immediately turned around to help the next person up. Tom smiled softly. I had a good example. Inside, they could hear the murmur of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter, the sound of connections being made and plans taking shape.